Daern, Chapter 1, The Edge of the World, Part 6, Gale. Hello? Gale was just getting up from his restless sleep, stumbling through the barley. He froze as the voice called out. He was wide awake now. Oroño? He felt his rapid heartbeats, sure that each one could be heard for a mile. Gale peered through an opening in the barley and caught sight of a tall, bald man, walking away, a sword swinging from his belt. He let loose his held breath as the stranger disappeared down the road. No, just a local. For a moment he was tempted to follow after him. Cannot do that. He looked down at his tattered clothing and dirty feet. I looked like nothing but trouble, and he wouldn't understand. He turned into the depths of the barley, his muscles stiff and uncooperative from last night's flight. Each step made him wince. All his toes had acquired a blister or two. His mind, however, felt more clear. He had a plan. Water, food, run. He slowed down when he sensed the barley was coming to an end. The stalks were getting shorter and the plants wider spaced. He crouched down and scurried ahead until he came to a low stone wall that marked the edge of the field. He eased up and looked over it. Beyond was a winding path, another stone wall, and yet more barley. The field that had sheltered him was just one of many. It was as though he was lost in a sea of grain. He'd never seen so much of one crop that he couldn't eat. Where's all the damn food? He ducked back down and moved along the wall, mind turning. He'd seen the lights of farmhouses last night. Houses meant people, and people meant food. Gale occasionally rose to check over the wall. It was nearly half an hour before he finally came upon a cottage. The cottage stood across the path, perched atop a small rise. It was built of roughly hewn stone, the gaps between sealed tight with mortar. The roof was thatched, and the eaves almost touched the ground to ward off the heavy winter snows. The entire building had been painted a cheerful green. Above the shuttered windows, Gale noticed that someone had added a few artful touches of flowers and vines. The sight of the well-tended house made Gale feel oddly homesick, though he wasn't sure why. He could barely remember his childhood home. He shook his head and turned to the large kitchen garden growing beside the cottage. Cucumbers climbed across crudely constructed frames. The frilly tops of carrots and beets sprang up from the dark earth. There were 2 rows of cabbages and another of spinach. Gale was pleased to see that a well also stood in the front yard. 2 birds with 1 stone. Before moving, he checked the windows of the house and saw the shutters were still closed. He crawled over the wall and darted behind the well. No one protested his passing, and everything was quiet except for the soft warbling of a songbird. Where is everybody? Still half expecting to be caught at any second, he threw down the well bucket. He winced as the splash reverberated in the hollow depths, but nothing stirred. Gale hauled up the bucket. Half of it sloshed down his front as he eagerly tipped the cool water into his throat. He came up for air with a satisfied sigh. Still dripping, he turned his attention to the garden. Skipping the carrots and beets for now, he made straight for the cucumbers. He tore the vegetables off the vine and bit down with relish. 3 of them vanished within a few seconds. Halfway through his 4th, however, he stopped mid-bite, imagining what he must look like. A dirty and ragged wretch, shoveling stolen food into his mouth like a mindless pig. It'll just be this one time. Gale swallowed the last piece of cucumber, wondering if he really believed that. Someday I'll make my own way, but I need to get away from the forest, and to do that, I need food. He unconsciously ran his tongue over a gap in his teeth. He'd lost the molar sometime during his 11th escape attempt. Or was it my 12th? He plucked at the sleeves of his ragged tunic. These'll do. He peeled off the garment and untied the sword from his belt. Clamping one sleeve against the ground with the weapon, he rested his weight on the flat of the blade and tugged. With some resistance, the sleeve tore. He mimicked the process with the other sleeve, and pulled what remained of his tunic back over his head. Using the rags that had bound his feet as a rope, he tied off one end of each sleeve to form 2 bags. He filled one with cucumbers and the second with carrots, shaking off as much dirt as he could in the process. Using a few more strips, he closed the tops of the bags and bound them together. After making a couple of crude loops, he dragged the whole thing over his shoulders. Feeling no desire to linger, he started back toward the barley. Just as he reached the road, Gale heard voices singing a crude song. He sprinted over the wall and dropped to the dirt as a wagon rumbled past. The wagon was filled with men and boys, carrying sickles. It must be harvest time. I need to get out of here. He adjusted his flimsy rucksack as he got up and plunged into the field. As Gale got closer to Stone's cradle, he angled away from it. He hoped to pass wide of the village. The confused reactions of humans were the last thing he wanted to deal with right now. And there was their safety to consider. He shivered as he thought of what might happen if the Mulroino got loose in the town. Gale was sure they would be delighted to collect a few more slaves. He ran out of barley around midday. Stone's cradle was now behind him to the east, the buildings hidden from view by one of the colossal boulders that gave the town its name. Before him, the land dropped off. He'd heard a fellow slave call this region the Giant Stair. Now that he'd seen it, Gale thought that was an accurate enough description. The ground sloped down in a series of terraces that stretched into the misty horizon. Each step was comprised of rough lines of boulders, some nearly as big as the ones that encircled the town. Splintered streams fed into still pools, trapped among the algae-coated stones. Even from here he could smell the acrid scent of decaying vegetation. It was impossible to follow any clear path through the natural maze. A road snaked its way out of the village and out above the rocky lowlands. It followed a high ridge that looked partially man-made. It was the most direct way down the stairs, but also the most obvious. He smiled grimly to himself and scrambled down the slope into the marshlands. Like to see them Mulroino bastards find me in here. His slender shadow was swallowed up in the gloom. Except for the soft splashing of his feet through the muddy water, nearly all sound faded the further he walked. Occasionally he would disturb wading birds as they tiptoed among the reeds and cattails that grew along the edge of the water. Their eerie cries of alarm ended abruptly, absorbed by the thick, humid air. As he trudged along, Gale slapped his neck. Clouds of mosquitoes swarmed up out of every stagnant puddle. He tried to find the driest route among the bogs, but every time he'd circumvent one, there would be another waiting behind the next rock. Aggravated by the constant delays and buzzing insects, Gale plunged into one of the pools, holding the sword above his head as he waded across. Feeling filthier than ever, he came out onto a slightly firmer patch of ground, but to his dismay, his new options weren't any more promising. To his left was a thick, muddy quagmire, out of which sprouted a crop of sickly-looking plants, whose leaves were oddly reminiscent of jaws. And to his right was an even wider pool than the one he had just traversed. Where am I? Another mosquito buzzing in his ear was the only response he received. As he swatted the insect, it dawned on him. I'm lost. This thought sank in and was followed by several equally troubling ones. What am I going to drink? He hadn't realized how thirsty he was until now. His drink at the well had been hours ago. Everywhere he turned, though, the water was either polluted with mud or scummed over with algae. What am I going to eat? He had maybe a dozen vegetables in the rucksack he'd made, but in all the hours he'd spent wandering around, he had seen nothing that looked remotely edible. His earlier three-word plan of water, food, and running had seemed simple and straightforward at the time. He'd heard about the Giant Stair, but nothing had prepared him for the labyrinth he now found himself in. I gotta get out of here. But what direction? Again, nothing answered him. Spurred on by a mixture of determination and desperation, he squished his way through the quagmire and clambered up the first large rock he found. He stood on the pinnacle of the stone, no longer caring about the possibility of being spotted. From his new vantage point he saw the road, but the path that would lead him towards it made his muscles ache just to look at it. As he watched, he saw two small figures speeding along the road toward the village. They were going so fast they must have been on horseback. If only I had a horse. Resigning himself to the inevitable, he climbed down the rock and into the far pool. As he made his way across, his feet sinking into the mud at the bottom, he realized a horse probably wouldn't be of much use anyway. Laird, please guide me out of this mess. Thanks for listening to Daern, a story in progress. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. And if you really enjoyed it, consider donating through Patreon. Any amount will go a long way towards helping us bring more content to you. Links to our Patreon and our website are in the description. See you next week, and have a good one.